Savannah, Georgia, a city where art, history, and charm blend seamlessly. In its historic district, the cobblestone streets hum with the whispers of the past, and the galleries buzz with excitement over the latest masterpieces. For Maurice Langston, an acclaimed art dealer, this city was more than just home. It was the stage where his passion and talent flourished. Known for his impeccable taste and a knack for discovering hidden gems, Maurice had built a reputation that stretched far beyond Savannah's borders. His gallery was a sanctuary for art lovers, a beacon for those who sought beauty and inspiration. But on a quiet evening in May 2006, the vibrant life Maurice had cultivated came to a violent and abrupt end. That night, his assistant Tasha arrived at his home for a scheduled meeting. She knocked on the door, expecting Maurice's usual warm smile and a lively discussion about the gallery's next big exhibit. Instead, she was met with silence. Concerned, she peered through the window, her breath catching as she glimpsed the scene inside. Maurice's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, surrounded by shards of broken glass and overturned furniture. The room, once filled with elegance and charm, now bore the scars of a brutal attack. As news of Maurice's death spread, Savannah's art community was plunged into shock. Friends, colleagues, and patrons struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could strike someone so deeply admired. The initial theory, a robbery gone wrong, seemed plausible, yet the details didn't quite add up. The art collection Maurice cherished remained untouched, and there were no signs of forced entry. Questions began to swirl, each more troubling than the last. And who could have done this, and why? The answers, when they finally began to surface, were far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. This was no random act of violence. Beneath the surface of Maurice's seemingly perfect life lay a tangled web of personal struggles, bitter disputes, and mounting tensions. At the center of it all was a man who had once been his closest confidant, his estranged ex-spouse, Caleb Richardson. Their relationship, once filled with promise, had devolved into a contentious battle over custody of their young son Jordan and lingering financial disputes that refused to be resolved. As investigators delved deeper into Maurice's life, they unearthed a series of clues that pointed to something far more calculated: threatening emails, suspicious financial transactions, and the chilling confession of a hired accomplice who claimed Caleb had orchestrated the entire plot. What began as a seemingly straightforward investigation soon unraveled into a story of betrayal, greed, and a shocking betrayal by someone Maurice had once trusted implicitly. This is the story of Maurice Langston, a man whose love for art and life was extinguished in a moment of unimaginable violence. Over the next hour and a half, we'll piece together the events that led to his untimely death, uncover the motives behind the crime, and explore the devastating impact it had on those who knew and loved him. So settle in and prepare to follow this trail of intrigue and betrayal to its startling conclusion. And as you do, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts on this case. Your theories and insights might just shed new light on the mystery. Maurice Langston was the kind of person who made an impression the moment he entered a room. Tall, with a commanding presence and a warm smile that could disarm even the most skeptical critic, he had a way of making people feel like they were part of something extraordinary. Maurice wasn't just an art dealer, he was a storyteller, someone who could breathe life into a painting with his words. He had an uncanny ability to uncover hidden treasures, often discovering works by underrepresented African American artists and elevating them to national prominence. His gallery, nestled in the heart of Savannah's historic district, was more than a business. It was a cultural hub, a place where art lovers gathered to celebrate creativity and community. But Maurice's success wasn't without its challenges. He was a perfectionist, driven by a relentless pursuit of excellence. Those close to him admired his passion but also recognized the toll it took on his personal life. His relationship with Caleb Richardson, his former spouse, was a prime example. Caleb had once worked alongside Maurice as a gallery assistant, and their shared love for art had brought them together. But what began as a partnership built on mutual admiration gradually became strained. Caleb was ambitious, with dreams of stepping out of Maurice's shadow and making a name for himself. Yet his fiery temper and impulsive decisions often clashed with Maurice's meticulous nature. Their separation was anything but amicable. Custody of their young son Jordan became a battleground, with each accusing the other of putting their ambitions ahead of the boy's well-being. Maurice fought to create a stable environment for Jordan, while Caleb argued that he deserved more time with his son. Friends and colleagues often found themselves caught in the middle, unsure of how to navigate the tension between the two. The backdrop to this drama was Savannah, Georgia, a city steeped in history and charm. The historic district, with its cobblestone streets, Spanish moss-draped oaks, and stately antebellum homes, was the epitome of Southern elegance. Tourists flocked to its squares and landmarks, marveling at the beauty that seemed frozen in time. But for those who lived there, Savannah was more than just a picturesque destination. It was a community where reputations were built and preserved, and where whispers of scandal could spread like wildfire. Maurice's gallery was a jewel in this setting, a space that reflected his impeccable taste and love for art. The walls were adorned with vibrant canvases, each telling a story of resilience, culture, and identity. The gallery was a place of light and inspiration, a sharp contrast to the turmoil that often consumed Maurice's personal life. Visitors marveled at the collection, unaware of the battles Maurice faced behind closed doors. Caleb, on the other hand, had moved to a modest apartment on the outskirts of town after their separation. While Maurice's world revolved around the gallery and its patrons, Caleb's life seemed to revolve around his frustrations. He often spoke of feeling overlooked, of wanting to prove himself in a city that seemed to favor Maurice's polished image. Those who knew Caleb described him as passionate but unpredictable, a man who could be charming one moment and confrontational the next. As the tensions between Maurice and Caleb escalated, friends began to notice subtle changes. Maurice, usually confident and composed, seemed distracted. He spoke less about his personal life and focused even more intently on his work. Caleb, meanwhile, became increasingly vocal about his grievances, often venting to anyone who would listen. The once shared dream of building a life together had long since crumbled, leaving behind resentment and unresolved conflicts. Savannah, with its blend of beauty and complexity, was the perfect stage for this unfolding drama. The city's serene exterior belied the tensions simmering beneath the surface. For Maurice and Caleb, it was a place that held both their brightest memories and their darkest moments. And for those who knew them, it was clear that their story was far from over. It was an unremarkable Tuesday evening in May 2006, the kind of night where the streets of Savannah's historic district were quiet, save for the occasional hum of distant conversations and the faint echo of footsteps on cobblestone. Maurice Langston's assistant, Tasha Coleman, was on her way to his home for what she thought would be a routine meeting. The gallery's next big exhibit was just weeks away, and Maurice, ever the perfectionist, had insisted they finalize the details in person. Tasha had worked with him for years and was used to his late-night brainstorming sessions, but as she approached his house, she couldn't shake an odd feeling, an uneasiness she couldn't quite place. Tasha arrived at the front door of Maurice's stately home, a classic Savannah property with white columns and an inviting porch framed by blooming hydrangeas. She knocked lightly, then louder when there was no response. Maurice was always punctual, meticulous about schedules. She checked her watch. He should have been home. She called his name, her voice cutting through the stillness of the evening. Nothing. She tried the doorbell. Still no answer. That's when her eyes drifted to the window. The curtains were slightly parted and she leaned closer to get a better look. At first, all she saw was the warm glow of the interior lights casting shadows on the walls. But then, something caught her eye, a figure lying on the floor. Her heart skipped a beat as she squinted to make sense of what she was seeing. Maurice. He was sprawled out, motionless, in the middle of the room. The glass coffee table near him was shattered, shards scattered like jagged stars across the polished wood floor. Furniture was overturned, and the once pristine living room looked like the aftermath of a violent struggle. Tasha's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She dialed 911, her voice shaking as she relayed what she had seen. I think my boss has been hurt. He's not moving. There's glass everywhere. Please, send someone quickly." The dispatcher assured her help was on the way, but those moments of waiting felt like an eternity. Tasha paced on the porch, glancing back at the window every few seconds, hoping, praying, that Maurice would stir, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew better. When the first responders arrived, the quiet street was soon flooded with flashing red and blue lights. Officers secured the scene while paramedics rushed inside. Tasha stood frozen on the porch, clutching her phone, her mind racing. She watched as the paramedics emerged moments later, their grim expressions confirming her worst fears. Maurice Langston was dead. Inside the house, investigators began their meticulous work. The scene was chaotic, but it didn't take long to rule out certain possibilities. Maurice had been stabbed multiple times, the wounds precise and deliberate. Yet nothing appeared to be stolen. His wallet and phone were still on the entryway table. His prized collection of paintings, worth millions, hung undisturbed on the walls. This was no robbery. Detectives noted the signs of a struggle, the broken glass, the overturned furniture, but there was no forced entry. Whoever had done this had likely been let in willingly. As they combed through the house, they found a few puzzling clues. A wine glass with smudged fingerprints sat on the counter, next to an open bottle of Maurice's favorite vintage. A half-written note was on his desk, its cryptic contents raising more questions than answers. And then there was the faint scent of cologne lingering in the air, one that didn't match anything Maurice owned. Outside, the neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Many of them spoke fondly of Maurice, describing him as a kind and generous man who had brought beauty to their community. But as the hours passed, whispers began to circulate. Who could have done this? And why? Tasha, still reeling from the shock, was questioned by detectives. She recounted the events of the evening, her voice breaking as she described finding Maurice through the window. He was just lying there, she said, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand. Who would want to hurt him? The investigation was only just beginning, but one thing was clear. This was no random act of violence. Maurice Langston's death was deliberate and calculated. And as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to come together, they would reveal a story of betrayal and greed that no one in Savannah could have anticipated. When news of Maurice Langston's murder broke, it was as if time stood still in Savannah. Word spread quickly from the cobblestone streets of the historic district to the quiet neighborhoods on the outskirts of town. For those who knew him, it was impossible to imagine that such a tragedy could strike someone like Maurice. He was admired, respected, and even loved by many. His gallery had been a beacon of creativity and culture, a place where strangers became friends over a shared admiration for art. Now it was the backdrop to a mystery that left everyone reeling. Friends and colleagues gathered outside the gallery in disbelief. They described Maurice as a man of generosity and kindness, someone who gave opportunities to artists who might otherwise have been overlooked. He had a way of seeing potential in people, one friend said, her voice trembling. Who would want to hurt someone like that? But as detectives began their work, it became clear that the answer to that question wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. In the first hours of the investigation, police struggled to find solid leads. The scene at Maurice's home was puzzling. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Maurice had known his killer. The lack of stolen valuables ruled out robbery. It was personal, intensely so. But without a clear suspect, the case felt like a maze with no exit. Then came the first breakthrough. Security footage from a camera mounted on a nearby street corner revealed a crucial clue. Just hours before Maurice's body was discovered, a hooded figure was seen walking toward his home. The figure's face was obscured, and their movements were deliberate, almost as if they were trying to avoid detection. The footage didn't capture them leaving, which led investigators to believe they had slipped away through the backyard or a side street. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As detectives worked to identify the hooded figure, they turned their attention to Maurice's personal life. It didn't take long for Caleb Richardson, his estranged ex-spouse, to emerge as a person of interest. Caleb had a well-documented history of conflict with Maurice, particularly when it came to their custody battle over their son Jordan. Friends of the couple described Caleb as passionate but unpredictable, a man who often let his emotions get the better of him. And then there were the emails. In the weeks leading up to Maurice's murder, Caleb had sent a series of messages that painted a picture of mounting tension. In one email, he accused Maurice of using his wealth and influence to keep Jordan away from him. "You're trying to erase me from my own son's life," one email read. "I won't let you win." Another message was even more direct. "If you don't start taking me seriously, you'll regret it." Detectives knew they couldn't ignore the emails, but they needed more than words to build a case. They began digging into Caleb's alibi for the night of the murder. Caleb claimed he had been at home, watching television, and had no knowledge of what had happened to Maurice. But his story quickly began to unravel. Phone records showed that Caleb had made several calls to a burner phone in the hours leading up to Maurice's death. When questioned about the calls, Caleb became defensive, refusing to explain who he had been speaking to or why. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from the crime scene provided another piece of the puzzle. The wine glass found on Maurice's counter contained fingerprints that didn't match his own. When the prints were run through the system, they came back as a partial match to someone in Caleb's extended social circle, a man with a history of petty crimes and a known association with Caleb. The discovery raised an unsettling question. Had Caleb enlisted someone else to do his bidding? The investigation took another turn when detectives uncovered financial records that revealed Caleb had been struggling with debt. Credit card statements showed mounting balances, late payments, and a string of questionable purchases. One particularly alarming transaction was a withdrawal of $10,000 in cash just days before Maurice's murder. Where had the money gone? And could it be connected to the burner phone calls or the fingerprints on the wine glass? As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, the picture they painted was one of desperation and resentment. Caleb's grievances with Maurice weren't just about custody. They were about control, pride, and, perhaps most importantly, money. Maurice's success had always been a sore spot for Caleb, and the custody battle had only deepened the rift between them. For investigators, it was becoming increasingly clear that Caleb had both motive and opportunity, but proving it in court would be another matter entirely. The community watched anxiously as the investigation unfolded, each new detail adding to the growing sense of unease. The idea that someone so close to Maurice could be involved in his death was almost too much to bear, and yet as the evidence mounted, it became harder to deny. The question now wasn't just who had killed Maurice Langston, it was whether justice would be served. Just when investigators thought they were piecing together the full story of Maurice Langston's tragic murder, a startling development turned the case on its head. A routine sweep of local records led detectives to an out-of-town drifter named Marcus Reed, a man with a checkered past and a penchant for trouble. Reed had been picked up on an unrelated charge in Jacksonville, Florida, but when officers questioned him about his movements in Savannah, his story unraveled in a way no one could have anticipated. Reed admitted to being in Savannah on the night of Maurice's murder. At first he claimed it was a coincidence. He was passing through town, looking for work. But as detectives pressed him, his demeanor shifted. Faced with mounting evidence and the threat of a long prison sentence, Reed made a shocking confession. He had been hired to kill Maurice Langston. According to Reed, the person behind the plot was none other than Caleb Richardson. Reed described Caleb as desperate and angry, a man who felt cornered and wanted to regain control of his life. Reed claimed Caleb had approached him weeks earlier with an offer that seemed too good to refuse, $15,000 in exchange for eliminating Maurice. Reed admitted he had hesitated at first, but the promise of quick money was enough to sway him. He described how Caleb had planned every detail, from the timing to the escape route, even instructing him to make the scene look chaotic to mislead investigators. The confession was a bombshell, but detectives knew they needed more than Reed's word to solidify their case. They began combing through Caleb's financial records and phone data, searching for a connection. What they found only deepened their suspicions. A series of bank withdrawals totaling $15,000 matched Reed's timeline, and text messages recovered from Caleb's phone revealed cryptic exchanges with a burner number traced back to Reed. The messages were short and vague, but their intent was unmistakable. "It's handled," one message read. Another simply said, "Tomorrow night." As investigators delved deeper, they uncovered even more damning evidence. GPS data from Caleb's phone placed him near Maurice's home on the night of the murder, despite his earlier claims that he had been at home watching television. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed Caleb purchasing a prepaid phone and what appeared to be gloves and duct tape just days before the crime. For detectives, it was the final piece of the puzzle. Caleb's carefully constructed alibi was falling apart, and the evidence against him was piling up. But Caleb wasn't going down without a fight. When confronted with Reed's confession and the mounting evidence, Caleb vehemently denied any involvement. He insisted that Reed was lying to save himself, and claimed he was being framed by Maurice's business rivals. Caleb pointed to a series of recent disputes Maurice had with other gallery owners in Savannah, suggesting they had more motive to harm him than he ever did. "I loved Maurice," Caleb said during his interrogation. "We had our issues, but I would never hurt him. This is all a setup." Caleb's claims of a conspiracy weren't entirely baseless. Maurice had been involved in a heated legal battle with a rival gallery over the rights to a high-profile art collection, and tensions between the two parties had escalated in the months leading up to his death. But detectives couldn't ignore the sheer weight of evidence pointing directly at Caleb. The financial transactions, the GPS data, the burner phone, all of it painted a picture of a man who had meticulously planned and executed a heinous crime. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed's testimony continued to provide chilling details about the night of the murder. He described how Caleb had driven him to Maurice's neighborhood, instructing him to wait until Maurice was alone. Reed recounted how he had entered the home through an unlocked back door and confronted Maurice in the living room. "He didn't even see it coming," Reed said during his confession, his voice devoid of emotion. "I did what I was paid to do and got out of there." But Reed's account wasn't without inconsistencies. He claimed Caleb had promised to pick him up after the job, but when he emerged from Maurice's home, Caleb was nowhere to be found. Reed was forced to flee on foot, leaving behind a trail of evidence that ultimately led investigators to his. The betrayal added another layer of complexity to an already twisted case, leaving detectives to wonder if Caleb had intended for Reed to take the fall all along. As the case gained national attention, the public was divided. Some believed Caleb's claims of being framed, pointing to the rivalry within Savannah's art community as a possible motive for setting him up. Others were convinced of his guilt, citing the overwhelming evidence and Reed's confession. The trial that followed would become one of the most watched and debated in recent history, with every revelation sparking new questions and theories. But for those closest to Maurice, the truth was all that mattered. They wanted justice for a man whose life had been cut short in such a brutal and senseless way. As the courtroom drama unfolded, the question lingered: was Caleb Richardson a grieving ex-spouse caught in a web of lies, or was he the mastermind behind a cold-blooded murder? The answer, it seemed, would depend on who you believed, and whether the jury would see through the smoke and mirrors to uncover the truth. The summer of 2006 brought a sense of closure to a case that had gripped Savannah and captivated the nation. After months of painstaking investigation, Caleb Richardson was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The trial that followed was nothing short of dramatic, with every detail dissected in front of a courtroom packed with reporters, art enthusiasts, and locals who had followed the case from the start. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Caleb as a man consumed by resentment and greed. They presented the financial transactions, the burner phone, the GPS data, and most damning of all, Marcus Reed's testimony. Reed took the stand and recounted in harrowing detail how Caleb had approached him with the plan, provided the money, and orchestrated the crime. His words were chilling, his tone devoid of remorse as he described the events leading up to Maurice's murder. For the jury, it was a moment of clarity in a case shrouded in complexities. The defense, however, fought back with equal fervor. Caleb's attorneys argued that Reed was an unreliable witness, a desperate man willing to say anything to reduce his own sentence. They highlighted inconsistencies in his story and questioned why Caleb would leave such an obvious trail if he truly intended to commit the perfect crime. They also resurrected the theory of Maurice's business rivals, suggesting that the financial disputes and legal battles Maurice faced provided ample motive for someone else to frame Caleb. But the evidence against Caleb was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just 2 days before delivering their verdict: guilty. Caleb Richardson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Caleb maintained his innocence, shaking his head and muttering, "I didn't do this, they got it all wrong." But his protests fell on deaf ears. For the Langston family, it was a moment of justice, albeit one that could never undo the loss they had suffered. As for Marcus Reed, his cooperation with authorities earned him a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a decision that sparked debate among the public. Some believed his testimony had been instrumental in bringing Caleb to justice, while others felt he deserved a harsher punishment for his direct role in Maurice's death. Regardless, Reed's words had sealed Caleb's fate and brought a measure of closure to the case. But even with the verdict, the impact of Maurice's murder reverberated far beyond the courtroom. His death left a void in Savannah's art community, a space that could never truly be filled. Maurice's gallery, once a hub of creativity and culture, now stands as a tribute to his legacy. Friends and colleagues have worked tirelessly to keep his vision alive, curating exhibitions that honor his passion for African American art and the stories it tells. For Maurice's son Jordan, the loss was immeasurable. Now, in the care of Maurice's sister, Jordan faces a future shaped by the tragedy that tore his family apart. The once happy boy who had spent weekends sketching in his father's gallery now carries the weight of a legacy he is too young to fully understand. Friends of the family describe Jordan as resilient but quiet, a child forced to grow up too soon in the shadow of a crime that shocked the world. The Langston family hopes that Maurice's story will serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the devastating consequences of greed, anger, and betrayal. They continue to advocate for victims of violent crime, channeling their grief into efforts to support others who have experienced similar losses. As the years pass, the case of Maurice Langston remains etched in Savannah's collective memory. It's a story that reminds us of the fragility of life, the complexities of human relationships, and the lengths some will go to when consumed by desperation. And while justice may have been served, the echoes of that fateful night in May 2006 will linger for years to come, a haunting reminder of the cost of betrayal. Maurice Langston's legacy lives on through his art, his gallery, and the memories of those who loved him. But the question that still lingers in the hearts of many is this: how could it all have come to this? How could a life so full of promise end in such tragedy? Perhaps we'll never fully understand, but one thing is certain: his story will not be forgotten. The story of Maurice Langston will echo through the halls of Savannah's art community and beyond for years to come. It's a case that reminds us how quickly lives can unravel when greed, resentment, and unchecked anger take hold. Maurice's murder wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal of trust, a severing of bonds that were meant to last a lifetime. And in the end, it leaves us asking questions that may never be fully answered. What drives someone to orchestrate such a heinous act against the very person they once shared a life with? Was it truly about money and custody? Or were there deeper wounds, buried beneath the surface, that led to such a tragic end? Caleb Richardson's motives may seem clear on paper, but the human heart is rarely so simple. Did he act out of desperation, or was this calculated, cold, and methodical? And Marcus Reed, what compels someone to become an accomplice in such a devastating act? Were his reasons purely financial, or did something else push him to cross that line? These are the questions that haunt us, the threads that keep this story alive in our minds. They remind us that, sometimes, the people we think we know best can harbor intentions we can never fully comprehend. Maurice Langston's death wasn't just a loss for his family or Savannah's art world. It was a loss for anyone who values creativity, community, and the power of human connection. But even in the face of such a tragedy, there's a glimmer of hope. Maurice's gallery continues to stand as a testament to his vision and passion. His friends, family, and colleagues are ensuring that his legacy isn't defined by his death, but by the life he lived and the art he championed. And for his son Jordan, the path forward may be uncertain, but he carries the strength of a father who believes in beauty, expression, and the power of art to heal. Now we turn the conversation over to you. What do you think truly drove Caleb Richardson to such lengths? Could there have been another layer to this story that we may never uncover? And what about Marcus Reed? Was his reduced sentence fair, or should he have faced a harsher penalty? We want to hear your thoughts, your theories, and your take on this complex and heartbreaking case. Share your opinions in the comments below.